Late 1944, a German general, a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front, is brought not to a cell, but to a comfortable room in Virginia. He's offered a thick steak, fresh coffee, and a carton of American cigarettes. Outside his window, there are no guard towers, no barbed wire, only manicured lawns and polite young officers. This isn't a prison camp, it's a country estate, and it is deeply unnerving. He doesn't know that every lamp, every chair is bugged. His confusion is the real weapon here. But to understand his disorientation, we must first understand what his soldiers witnessed on the battlefields of France. Their raw, unfiltered observations exist in declassified interrogation reports and secretly recorded conversations. These documents reveal a journey from initial contempt to growing shock, and finally, a grudging understanding. This is an investigation into one central question. What systemic reality of American power was so alien to the German military mind that it could only be understood after capture? But before that collision in 1944, the Wehrmacht held a clear and profoundly dangerous picture of the American soldier. By the summer of 1944, the German army awaiting the invasion was a paradox of strength and decay. Its core was arguably the most professional fighting force on Earth. Its officers and non-commissioned officers were masters of a doctrine called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. This philosophy trusted a 20-year-old sergeant to understand not just his orders, but his commander's intent, empowering him to adapt, improvise, and lead on a chaotic battlefield. These were veterans of a brutal, 5-year education in war, from the snows of Moscow to the sands of Africa. They saw themselves not as cogs, but as artists of combat. But this guild of veterans was living on borrowed time. Beneath the surface of professionalism, the Wehrmacht was hollowed out. Panzer divisions in France had fuel for only a few days of sustained combat. For every 10 trucks lost, maybe one could be replaced. Most critically, for every battle-hardened squad leader killed, the replacement was often a teenager with just weeks of training. The army was a finely tuned engine, but it was running out of fuel and spare parts. Its greatest asset, its experienced men, was becoming an endangered species. This grim reality was offset by a dangerous sense of confidence, fed by German intelligence and propaganda. The arriving Americans were painted as soft, materialistic amateurs, soldiers from a consumer society who had never known hardship, led by businessmen in uniform who were tactically inept. The German command was convinced that the superior fighting spirit and experience of their soldiers, their Kampferfahrung, would easily shatter the morale of this untested force. It was to be a contest between warriors and mechanics. The entire German strategy, therefore, rested on a single, massive gamble, that their qualitative edge could inflict a decisive blow before America's quantitative superiority could be brought to bear. They prepared for a battle of skill. They were completely unprepared for a battle of spreadsheets. The first hint that their assessment was catastrophically wrong would not be a brilliant general or a new secret weapon. It would be a sound, a relentless industrial roar that began in the fields of Normandy and would follow them to the very end. For the German veterans, the sound was familiar, but the logic was alien. They had endured the massive Soviet barrages on the Eastern Front, terrifying but often indiscriminate. This was different. This was responsive. In their reports, they described it as a conveyor belt of steel, or a steel storm that seemed to anticipate their every move. A single German squad moving through an orchard could suddenly find itself at the center of a divisional-level concentration of fire. This wasn't just artillery supporting an attack. This was artillery as the main event, systematically erasing grid squares from the map. American 105mm and 155mm howitzers, coordinated by radio, could bring down a time-on-target strike, where shells from dozens of guns fired at different times all landed in the same second. It was a terrifyingly efficient, impersonal process. It rendered hard-won experience and tactical cunning almost meaningless. But this storm of steel was just the most audible symptom of a much deeper phenomenon. As more Germans were captured and brought to interrogation centers, the full, bewildering picture began to emerge. At interrogation centers like Fort Hunt, Virginia, the bugged conversations revealed that the first and most universal shock for the German soldier was not a tactic, but a spectacle, the sheer, unbelievable mountain of American material. In transcripts, prisoners speak in hushed, disbelieving tones about what they witnessed. They describe seeing American GIs throw away half-eaten tins of food, perfectly good tools, even functioning weapons, simply because they were cumbersome to carry. To a soldier from the resource-starved Wehrmacht, where every rifle and every liter of fuel was precious, this was not just waste, it was sacrilege. It defied all military logic they had ever known. This individual wastefulness was just a symptom of a logistical system they could barely comprehend. They talked about the endless columns of trucks on the Red Ball Express, a non-stop supply loop that ran 24 hours a day, delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies to the front lines daily. One captured German quartermaster calculated that the fuel consumed by this single operation would have been enough to power an entire Panzer Army's offensive for a week. They had prepared for a battle against soldiers. They found themselves in a battle against an assembly line. The second shock was more personal, and it cut deeper into their professional pride. German officers, masters of Auftragstaktik, were initially dismissive of American junior leadership. They saw them as amateurs, lacking the rigorous, almost philosophical training of the German NCO Corps. But the recordings reveal a growing confusion. They noted, with a mix of irritation and grudging respect, a different kind of initiative. A German sergeant, finding his path blocked by a destroyed bridge, would secure the perimeter and radio his commander for instructions, as doctrine dictated. His American counterpart, they observed, would often just solve the problem. He'd find a jeep, drive back until he found an engineer unit, and return with a bulldozer to clear a new path through the woods. It wasn't the sophisticated tactical initiative of Auftragstaktik. It was something more direct, more brutally practical, a kind of problem-solving confidence born from the assumption that a tool for any job was always, somewhere, available. But perhaps the most demoralizing discovery of all was what they began to call the ghost divisions. In the German army, when a division was mauled in combat, suffering 40 or 50% casualties, it was effectively destroyed. It would be pulled from the line for months, sometimes never returning to its former strength. Its experienced survivors would be scattered as replacements, its identity erased. They watched as American divisions suffered the same or even worse casualties in the brutal fighting in places like the Hürtgen Forest. And then, a week or two later, German intelligence would report the same division was back in the line, at nearly full strength. New tanks, new artillery, and an endless supply of fresh-faced replacements had materialized as if from nowhere. For the German Lancer, it felt like fighting a phantom. They could win a battle, inflict horrific losses, but they couldn't inflict a permanent victory. The enemy they bled white today would simply be reconstituted tomorrow. It created a profound sense of futility. Finally, there was the strangeness of their own captivity. Instead of the expected brutality of a victorious enemy, they were met with a baffling, almost impersonal process. They were disarmed, searched, and then given medical attention, even for minor wounds. They received regular meals, clean clothes, and were sent to camps that were, by the standards of the Eastern Front, almost luxurious. Some prisoners interpreted this as a sign of American weakness, a softness that proved their enemy lacked a true warrior spirit. But the more perceptive officers, listening to their fellow prisoners in the bugged rooms of Fort Hunt, began to see it differently. The good treatment wasn't softness, it was efficiency. They realized they were being processed with the same methodical, well-resourced logic that delivered artillery shells and replacement soldiers. They were no longer enemy combatants to be defeated. They were a problem to be managed, a source of data to be extracted. Individually, these were all shocking observations, but as the prisoners talked, a few of the more senior officers began to connect the dots. The overwhelming firepower, the infinite logistics, the amateur initiative, the ghost divisions, they weren't separate advantages. They were all symptoms of the same, single, terrifying reality. The breakthrough occurred in the bugged conversations. As senior officers began connecting the reports from their men, the initial conclusion, that America simply had more, was evolving into a more profound and disturbing realization. The artillery's endless shells were not a separate miracle from the logistical chain. They were its direct result. The American sergeant's bold improvisation wasn't a lack of discipline. It was a confidence born from the certainty that a spare part or a bulldozer was always available. The true enemy wasn't the soldier in the opposing foxhole. It was the invisible invisible, continent-spanning system that put him there, armed him, and guaranteed that if he fell, another would instantly take his place. This wasn't a battle of tactics. It was a collision with a new philosophy of war, one they couldn't counter on the battlefield. And in one of these recordings, a captured general would finally give a name to this terrifyingly impersonal power. In one of the most candid, secretly recorded exchanges from Fort Hunt, a high-ranking German general, a veteran commander of panzer divisions, finally articulated the devastating truth to a fellow captive. He wasn't complaining about American courage or tactics. He was defining a fundamental difference in philosophies. Germany, he mused, had perfected the art of the 90-day campaign, the brilliant, decisive, masterful battle. But America, he concluded, had perfected the art of a 3-year war. The German way, he explained, was to craft the world's finest soldier. The American way was different. They didn't train soldiers in the same manner. They built an army that runs like a factory. And, he stated, you cannot defeat a factory by winning a battle. This was the intellectual surrender. It was the quiet, stark admission that Germany's entire military paradigm, built on the genius of the battlefield, was obsolete against an enemy who had turned warfare itself into an industrial process. And so we return to that general in Virginia, with his steak dinner and American cigarettes. His profound disorientation now makes sense. The polite treatment wasn't kindness, nor was it weakness. It was just another component of the factory. The same industrial logic that mass-produced artillery shells also mass-produced intelligence. Comfort was a tool to make a prisoner relax. The hidden microphones were a tool to make him talk. The final, devastating realization for men like him was not simply that America was rich. It was that America's entire industrial culture, its belief in systems, efficiency, and scalable solutions, had been weaponized. For the German soldier, this meant America's most decisive weapon was never fired from a gun. It was a weapon forged, piece by relentless piece, on an assembly line 3,000 miles away.